Hi there, I'm James LaVeck, and this is Life After Losses, where I share reflections on what it means to live with loss and how we live beyond it. This is entry 272. You can stop hiding behind survival. There was a time when survival was everything, and for many of us, it took real courage to just endure. But what happens if survival is no longer the only goal? Now, today I want to talk about the difference between honoring what we endured and continuing to define ourselves by it. So let's get into it. There was a time when survival was the goal. Getting through the day was enough. Holding it together was enough. Not collapsing was enough. And during that time of my life, surviving wasn't a weakness. It took every bit of courage to do so. And many of us have lived in that space. We've navigated loss. We've absorbed impact. We've rebuilt after things fractured. And in those moments, survival is not small. It's everything. But survival isn't meant to be permanent. There comes a point when the crisis that demanded all of our attention is no longer running the show. Now, this loss is still part of you. The history is still real, but you're no longer in free fall, and that's where something subtle and maybe a little uncomfortable can happen. We keep speaking the language of survival long after we're stable. We describe ourselves as barely holding on. We default to endurance. We explain our hesitation by pointing to things that we've been through. Sometimes that's still true, and sometimes it's not. Survival can become a shield. It protects us from expectation. It protects us from risk. It protects us from having to choose something new. And if we're still in recovery, then we don't have to stretch. If we're still getting through it, we don't have to build. And if we're still just surviving, we don't have to risk wanting more. That language feels safe because it once was the truth. And at some point, though, it stops being protection and starts being cover. It starts to become an excuse for not living. Now, let me be clear, that's not an accusation. It's an observation. Been there, done that. And I've seen it many times. There's a difference between honoring what you endured and continuing to define yourself by it. We don't have to erase the struggle. We don't have to minimize the pain. We don't have to pretend it didn't shape us. But we also don't have to keep hiding behind it. Now, survival is no longer the only goal. The question changes. Not, how do I get through this, but what am I choosing now? That is a harder question. Because choice requires ownership. Choice requires intention. Choice requires us to stop pointing backward and start looking forward. It's easier to endure than it is to build. It's easier to stabilize than it is to expand, but renewed purpose isn't cultivated inside survival mode. It grows when we admit that we're no longer trying to stay afloat. It grows when we acknowledge that stability, even imperfect stability, gives us options. We may not feel ready, we may not feel certain, we may not feel fully healed, but healing isn't a prerequisite for growth, and survival isn't the final destination. Staying in survival mode rather, feels justified. It explains our pace, it explains our reluctance, it explains why we're not stepping into something bigger. But if we're honest, sometimes it also protects us from discomfort that has nothing to do with loss anymore. Fear of failing, fear of choosing wrong, fear of wanting something new and not getting it. Survival kept us focused on the endurance. Building requires exposure. When you're surviving, expectations are lower. When you're building, responsibility arises, and responsibility can feel heavier than grief ever did. Because grief happened to us. Choice belongs to us. And that's the pivot. There comes a point where we're no longer reacting to what happened. We're responding to what is possible. And that doesn't mean the past disappears. It means it stops being the only explanation for why we aren't moving. Renewed purpose isn't about denying what we've endured. It's about refusing to let endurance be the ceiling. We can be grateful for survival. We can still admit that we're capable of more than maintenance. So maybe the better question isn't, are we still surviving? And maybe it's this. Where are we using survival language to avoid building something new? Again, not shaming. It's about being aware. And awareness is where agency begins. We survived. That took courage. Now building will take intention. And intention requires us to step forward without the shield. Because we have something to build, not something to prove. That might be worth considering. Thanks for watching.